The air was heavy with tension as the crowded playground buzzed with the sounds of children laughing and playing. Amidst the noise, a small figure stood off to the side, his face scrunched up in quiet sorrow. Jacob, no older than 8, clutched his stomach, tears threatening to spill as he wiped them away with the back of his hand. He was alone, ignored by his classmates who ran past him, too busy to notice his discomfort. It wasn't just hunger gnawing at him. It was the emptiness that had settled deep within his chest. His mother, who promised to be there when he needed her most, was nowhere to be found, leaving him feeling more isolated than ever. Across the yard, a little girl, Lily, watched him curiously. She had been playing with her friends, her giggles ringing through the air, but something about Jacob's sorrow caught her attention. Without a second thought, she approached him, her small hands clutching a piece of candy. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, her big eyes full of concern. Jacob hesitated for a moment, then nodded, though it was clear from his hunched shoulders that he was anything but fine. Without speaking another word, Lily offered him the candy. The gesture was simple, but it was enough to stir something in Jacob's heart, a flicker of hope that had long been extinguished. As he reached for the treat, something unexpected happened. A woman, his mother, appeared, her face twisted in anger. What she said next would leave both sets of parents in stunned silence. Jacob's life had never been easy. His father had left when he was barely old enough to understand the concept of absence, and his mother, despite her best efforts, had always been distracted, overwhelmed by the pressures of her own struggles. Jacob learned early on that he couldn't rely on anyone. He had learned to fend for himself, even at such a young age. His teachers often described him as quiet, withdrawn, and self-sufficient, a child who preferred to sit in the back of the class, his eyes cast downward, lost in thoughts too big for his age. But what his teachers didn't see were the moments when he lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of loneliness pressing down on his chest. His mother, in her own way, loved him. But love, he had learned, didn't always mean presence or attention. She worked long hours at the diner, often coming home late, exhausted and irritable. She had tried to make up for her absence by buying him small gifts or letting him stay up late watching TV, but it was clear to Jacob that she was often too tired, too overwhelmed by her own life to see his. Jacob had never been one to ask for help. He never cried in front of others, never let on just how much he longed for his mother's affection or the simple comfort of knowing that someone cared. The hunger in his belly was just a physical manifestation of the emptiness he often felt inside, a deep longing for something that seemed out of his reach. The other children didn't notice him, and if they did, it was with fleeting curiosity, never lasting concern. When Lily had approached him, the unexpected kindness was like a lifeline. He hadn't realized how starved he was, not just for food, but for human connection. Her simple gesture, giving him the candy, was more than just a sweet act. It was an acknowledgement that he existed, that he mattered. It was a small but powerful reminder that perhaps not all people would turn their backs on him. But Jacob had no idea that this small kindness would soon set off a chain of events that would change everything. Jacob's heart raced as he clutched the candy in his hand. Lily's innocent act of kindness had been enough to break through the hard shell he had built around himself. For a brief moment he felt seen, and it almost made him forget the gnawing emptiness that had always been there. But before he could even take a bite, his mother appeared, her steps quick and purposeful as she marched toward him. The warmth from Lily's smile faded the instant Jacob's mother reached them, her face tight with anger. "Jacob!" she snapped, her voice sharp enough to send a jolt through him. "What are you doing? Didn't I tell you not to talk to strangers?" Lily stepped back, her eyes wide and confused, not understanding the sudden tension in the air. Jacob, meanwhile, felt a familiar wave of shame wash over him. His mother's gaze was harsh, her disappointment almost palpable. The last thing he wanted was to embarrass her, to make her feel like she had failed him again. But he had no idea what was happening. Why had his mother reacted like that? She didn't usually speak to him with such anger, especially not in front of others. He felt his stomach twist, the candy suddenly feeling heavy in his palm. "Mom, she just gave me some candy," Jacob said quietly, hoping to explain. His voice cracked as he spoke, his vulnerability becoming all too evident. "She's not your friend, Jacob," his mother snapped, her eyes flashing with something that Jacob couldn't quite place. "I told you to stay away from people like that. You can't trust everyone who pretends to be nice to you." Lily, still standing there with her innocent smile, looked at Jacob, confusion turning to hurt. She didn't understand why Jacob's mother was angry. She only wanted to help him, to share something small with someone who seemed to need it. But as she watched Jacob's face fall, something inside her shifted. She didn't know why his mother had reacted that way, but she knew one thing for sure. Jacob didn't deserve to be treated like this. Jacob's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He could feel the eyes of the other children on them, the whispers beginning to ripple through the playground. He wanted to run, to hide, but instead, he stood frozen in place, the candy still clutched in his trembling hand. His mother, clearly flustered, glanced over at the other parents, as if seeking their judgment or approval. Her expression was tight, defensive, as if she were fighting a battle he didn't understand. Then, the unexpected happened. Lily's mother, who had been sitting on a nearby bench, watching the interaction unfold, stood up and walked over. She had been observing the scene with quiet concern, noticing the way Jacob's mother had snapped at her daughter and the hurt in both children's eyes. Without a word, she addressed Jacob's mother in a calm but firm tone. "I'm sorry," Lily's mother said softly, "but you can't speak to a child like that, especially in front of others. He's just a kid." Jacob's mother flinched, clearly caught off guard by the sudden confrontation. "Excuse me," she replied, her voice defensive, but the uncertainty was clear. Lily's mother didn't back down. "You're clearly upset, but you can't take it out on him. That little girl did nothing wrong. And you," she paused, looking at Jacob's mother, "you need to realize how much your son needs you, even if you don't see it." Jacob's mother's face flushed a deep red, a mixture of embarrassment and anger rising to the surface. For a moment, the two women locked eyes, an unspoken tension hanging in the air. Jacob, standing in the middle of it all, felt his heart pound, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like never before. His mother, usually so distant, was caught off guard, and Lily's mother, who had never met him before, had just stood up for him. Jacob had never felt more exposed in his life, but at the same time, he couldn't help but feel a tiny spark of hope. Was it possible that someone, anyone, could see him as he truly was, not just as a problem or a nuisance, but as a person worth caring about? As the words between the two women continued to simmer, Jacob stood frozen, holding the candy in his hand, unsure of what to do next. The tension on the playground was unbearable. The world seemed to shrink down to just the three of them, Jacob, his mother, and Lily's mother. The other children's voices faded into the background, replaced by the rapid pounding of Jacob's heart. His hands shook, the candy in his grasp now feeling like a lifeline. He wanted to say something, to make it stop, to make his mother understand, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was stand there, helpless. His mother's face twisted in fury. "Who do you think you are, coming over here and lecturing me about my son?" She shot at Lily's mother. "You don't know anything about us, about what we've been through." The words stung, but they were nothing compared to the icy silence that followed. Jacob had heard those words before, when his mother would snap at him for being too much of a burden, for not understanding what she was going through. He knew this argument. It was one they'd had countless times, always ending in more distance, more isolation. But this time, something was different. Lily's mother didn't flinch. Instead, she took a step closer, her voice low but firm. "I know what it's like to feel alone, but your son doesn't deserve to feel that way." She glanced at Jacob, who was still holding the candy like it was all he had left in the world. "He needs you more than anything." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Jacob's mother stared at the ground, her chest rising and falling with each shaky breath. The anger in her eyes slowly began to fade, replaced by something Jacob had never seen before: guilt. For the first time, he saw her not as a woman who was always angry, always frustrated, but as a person who was broken in her own way. Then, without warning, Jacob's mother's voice cracked. I don't know how to do this." She looked up at Lily's mother, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to be what he needs me to be." The moment hung in the air, heavy with the unspoken truth. For the first time, Jacob felt as though his mother was not just a distant figure in his life, but a person who was struggling, just like him. And in that quiet, fragile moment, the distance between them seemed to close just a little. The playground was still, the usual chaos now muted, as if the world was waiting for something to shift. Jacob's mother stood there, trembling, her walls slowly crumbling under the weight of her own realization. She had been holding on to her anger, her frustrations for so long, never truly facing the depth of her own pain. But now, standing in front of Lily's mother, someone who had shown kindness to a child she barely knew, her defenses faltered. Jacob felt the tension ease just a little. His mother's gaze, once sharp and unyielding, softened. She wasn't looking at him like she always had, as if he was a problem to fix or an inconvenience. For the first time, she was seeing him as something else. Her son. Lily's mother didn't say anything more. She simply nodded, as if understanding that the battle had been won in the quiet moments between words. She glanced at Jacob, giving him a gentle, reassuring smile, before turning to walk back to her daughter. Jacob felt a surge of gratitude toward the woman, even though she'd done nothing more than stand up for him. It was as if her actions had unlocked something inside of him that had been locked away for years. Jacob's mother remained silent for a long while, her eyes glued to the ground. She hadn't expected to break down like this, hadn't expected to be confronted with the stark truth of her shortcomings as a mother. But there was no denying it now. She had been neglecting her son, pushing him away because she didn't know how to deal with her own pain. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she took a deep breath. Slowly, she crouched down in front of Jacob, her hands shaking. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The words seemed so small compared to the weight of everything she had failed to say, but they were a start. Jacob looked up at her, his chest tight with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "It's okay, Mom," he said softly, the words feeling like they came from a place of both hope and sorrow. "I just want us to be okay." His mother smiled weakly, tears welling in her eyes. "We will be," she promised, the sincerity in her voice a quiet vow to change, to try. The bond that had felt so fragile for so long seemed to pulse with new life. There was no magic fix, no instant cure for the wounds they both carried, but for the first time in a long while, Jacob felt like maybe, just maybe, they were on the right path. In the days that followed, something shifted. It wasn't immediate or dramatic, but a quiet, unspoken understanding settled between Jacob and his mother. They didn't speak of the confrontation at the playground again. Not directly, at least, but there was a softness now when she looked at him, a gentleness in her touch. She began to make an effort, a real one, to show him she cared. It wasn't perfect. There were still days when the weight of life would pull her back into herself. But for the first time in years, Jacob felt seen. His mother started making small changes, taking him to the park after school, asking about his day, and listening when he spoke. They even shared small moments of laughter, moments that used to feel impossible, as if the laughter between them had been lost in the tension of years gone by. But now, it was finding its way back, little by little. Jacob's own transformation was just as gradual. He began to let his guard down, allowing himself to hope for a better future. He found himself opening up to his mother, sharing more of his thoughts and fears, no longer burdened by the weight of isolation. The candy Lily had given him seemed to symbolize something bigger than just a piece of candy. It was the spark that ignited a change he hadn't thought possible. There was still work to be done, still healing to take place. But for the first time, Jacob believed that healing was possible. that his family could rebuild piece by piece just like him. And that, in itself, was a victory. As he sat with his mother one evening, watching the sunset from their front porch, Jacob felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. And for now, that was enough. This story reminds us that kindness can break down walls, even those built from years of pain and misunderstanding. It shows that the smallest gestures, like sharing a piece of candy, can plant seeds of hope in places where they seem impossible to grow. Sometimes, the greatest transformations begin with a simple moment of connection, a willingness to see someone for who they truly are, not just as a reflection of our own struggles. In the end, the story highlights the power of vulnerability and the importance of understanding and forgiveness. It's a reminder that we are all capable of change, that healing comes not from perfection, but from the courage to begin, no matter how small the steps may seem. And sometimes, it's the people we least expect who help us find our way back to each other.